Good morning, students. It's the last section of film history. Let's get started. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Sound familiar? Famous line from a movie that was incidentally set here in Georgia. Those were the words that Rhett Butler used to break up with Scarlett O'Hara at the end of Gone with the Wind. If you haven't seen Gone with the Wind, set aside 3.5 hours for yourself and go see it sometime because it's long. But it's a classic film, and if you're filmmakers, you got to see the classics. You got to see these movies. Now, with that line, he ignited a firestorm of controversy because you couldn't say things like damn in the movies in those days. That was, considered a bad word, and movies were very conservative. And so there were a lot of people who were up in arms about that, in particular, members of Congress. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, in addition to that, this was a weird time in Hollywood. Hollywood was known for its excesses, stars that were out of control, getting paid huge sums of money, didn't have a lot of self-control, and doing, immature and ridiculous things on a pretty regular basis. Even though they were under contract to studios, studios would come out and fix the problem. If they did something that was completely inappropriate, the studio heads had people hired to go out and settle the score, pay people off, including the police in some cases. Tabloid newspapers became popular in those days. That's when they all started out, because they reported on all these excesses of the Hollywood stars. And, that was the root of tabloids. Hollywood gained its reputation then of being Sin City. More than Vegas was at the time, Hollywood was considered Sin City. Now, it was confirmed in the 1920s when Hollywood had two major scandals. Does he look familiar? Probably not. He was a silent film actor who made the transition to talkies, but only barely. That's Fatty Arbuckle, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. He was known for these huge Hollywood parties, and at one of these parties, a young actress named Virginia Rappe was raped by Arbuckle, and she ended up with a UTI, urinary tract infection, which then resulted in peritonitis, which ultimately killed her. And he was accused of her death and put on trial for contributing to her death as well as her rape. It was a huge scandal at the time. It signified the end of his career. He couldn't get any more jobs after that, even though he was hugely popular as a silent film actor. It was, a crazy time. Now, after 3 trials, 2 that were resulted in mistrials and hung juries, Arbuckle was ultimately acquitted, but still it was the end of his career. Now, the public wasn't forgiving. Arbuckle never made another feature. He died in 1933 of a heart attack at the age of 46. So his excessive lifestyle caught up with him, as well as, the experiences with the court system. Now, then film director William Taylor was found murdered, and Mabel Normand, a famous actress and a good friend of Fatty Arbuckle's, was accused of the crime. Even though Normand was acquitted, rumors abounded that drugs were involved, the tabloids had a field day, and the Catholic Legion of Decency called for a boycott of all Hollywood productions. I mean, they're all films, not just ones that these actors are in, but all films. Fearing a public backlash and the likelihood of government censorship, the studio heads acted quickly. Now, this was the studio days of Hollywood. This was when, the moguls were in charge, the cigar chomping, I'll tell you what, I'll put you in the movies and make you famous, kid. Those kind of moguls, like Harvey Weinstein, was the last of the moguls. And these guys were not real honorable. They were there for a buck, right? And so they saw the handwriting on the wall. They realized that film's popularity was dropping because of all these scandals. So they decided to do something about it, to preempt the problems that they saw coming. So what they did was they picked Will Hayes, a Republican conservative and Republican Party chairman, to head a new Motion Picture Producers Association, MPPA. Does that sound familiar? It should, because they're the rating system. That's MPPA ratings. And they've been around ever since the 1930s when these scandals took place. And they put together a very strict, Will Hayes put together a very strict system of ratings for the movies, which these days would result in a lot of movies being censored. First thing they did was ban all of Arbuckle's films. You can't even find some of those feature films anymore because they were destroyed. The Hayes Production Code was issued in 1930. To be acceptable, films had to show the Production Code Administration, PCA seal, at the beginning of a film. The code was so strict that many of today's G-rated movies would have been rejected. Hayes issued more than 28,000 rulings. Talk about run amok. Including lists of forbidden words. Screen kisses were reduced from a maximum of 4 seconds to no more than 1.5 seconds. And the Hayes Code went so far as to ban scenes showing people milking cows. That's pornographic. Now, after the stock market crash of 1929, the bottom fell out of financial markets in the United States and film revenues sank. So, even though the studios were overextended financially, Hollywood was spared major economic damage because what are you going to do when you've lost everything? You're going to want escapism. And we couldn't watch television like we're doing right now. Tiger King. And so people resorted to going to the movies. So movies stayed popular. Problem was, the people who funded movies had lost a huge amount of money in the stock market crash, and there wasn't that easy source of revenue to fund additional films. So, this was also the beginning of the sound era. The sound era helped to propel Hollywood through those difficult times. Now, moviegoers anxious to escape the gloom of the Depression sought refuge in the theaters. To lure patrons during this time, this is a quiz question, many theaters started showing double features, 2 for 1, and they drastically cut admission prices, which we haven't seen since then, have we? Some theaters even featured bingo games. Can you imagine going to the theater and playing bingo because they want to get you in the seats? Even still, they needed something more. There wasn't enough to keep the popularity up, and these guys are used to living at a high lifestyle. They want to keep movies popular. So, what did they do? They did what Hollywood always does. Every time there is a downturn, they went to sexier films because we love sex. So, and the risque storylines infuriated Will Hayes because he's trying to control that in Hollywood. Suddenly, films are getting sexier to make up for the sagging box office. So, without the added Hollywood revenues from risque content, Hollywood wouldn't have survived the Depression. A lot of those studios would have closed, but they're still around today because of the fact that they resorted to those sexier storylines. So, this is Mae West. Mae West was a famous actress of the day, buxom, outspoken, really popular. She said things that women wish that they could say. And if you have not seen a Mae West movie, click on one of the links. It's worth seeing what she was like. There's excerpts from some of her movies there. Her provocative line delivered to Cary Grant was, "Why don't you come up and see me sometime?" Right? You've heard that line before, right? Hayes and conservative audience members were aghast that such a suggestion would be spoken aloud in the movies. So, of course, they hated Mae West. During the Depression, the only successful new studio was opened by Walt Disney. Walt Disney opened Disney Studios in 1928. with his first animated short cartoon, Steamboat Willie, which is now in the public domain. Disney was only 26 years old at that point. He had to sell his car to finish the cartoon. In 1932, color film technology was introduced with another short Disney film, Flowers and Trees, which, not a classic, but there's movement toward the desire for color movies at that point. A few years later, Disney created Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, his first feature-length animated movie. It cost $2.25 million to make. It was a lot of money at the time. It was a big gamble, but it paid off big time because, now it's Disney, of course, is one of the largest media conglomerates in the world and, owns theme parks all over the place. You know how that turned out. Now, by 1935, 95% of Hollywood films were talkies. Really quick. I mean, we're talking from 1930 to 1935. That quick, sound was adopted. So, it took a while, but films adjusted to the extra demands of sound. Production values raised up again. Remember, we were talking last time about how they dropped. Now they're raising back up. And at this point, a new genre of film was born, the musical. And, the formerly popular slapstick was kind of supplanted by the musical. Musicals were easy to adapt to foreign sales, and they're universally popular with all ethnicities and social status. So, during the 1930s, another couple of genres emerged. The gangster films and romantic comedies, as well as thrillers. Now, who's the most famous director of thrillers? Of course, Alfred Hitchcock. And if you have not seen the shower scene in Psycho, click on the link, watch that scene. It's been parodied and copied time and time again, but it is considered one of the finest short segments of filmmaking ever done. In 1939, Gone with the Wind. And the Civil War epic was the first time color was lavishly and expertly used. We have talked about the fact that it was the first time a art director became a production designer. William Cameron Menzies was given the title of production designer because of the elaborate sets that were created for Gone with the Wind. Watch the trailer. At the very least, you'll see the amazing accomplishment that movie was for its time. More than 50 years later, CBS paid $25 million for the TV broadcast rights, disproving the notion that films would have a hard time holding the interest of modern audiences. So, 50 years later, still popular film. Now, it's 75 years later now. Gone with the Wind is historically significant for many reasons. For one, the kiss, the long kiss, was a violation of the Hays Code, kind of like, yeah, we got you. The memorable and controversial line, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And this was the indication that Rhett Butler had given up on Scarlett O'Hara. It was the culminating scene in the film. You talk about putting it in people's faces. They put it in people's faces. It's like thumbing your nose at the Hays Code. Now, 2 years later, Orson Welles released Citizen Kane, still on the AFI list as the #1 movie in history. If you have not seen Citizen Kane and you consider yourself a filmmaker, you got to go see this movie. Well, you're not going to go see it. You're going to go to your television and see it. But you got to watch it. It is a classic piece of American cinema, still shot in black and white, but more effective in black and white, I think, and has some amazing performances. But it was not a box office success. It was a flop to begin with. It ultimately made its money back, but only because the critics embraced it. They said, this is a work of genius. And it really was. It set new standards. It was the first time actors had not just delivered a line and waited for a response. They talk over each other. There were shots in that movie I still look at and go, how did they do that? There's a scene with, it's basically the life of William Randolph Hearst. Hearst being the newspaper magnate of those days. Everybody knew it was about William Randolph Hearst, including Hearst. Hearst wouldn't let ads be run in his magazines and newspapers because he knew it was about him. And it was not a favorable look at William Randolph Hearst, even though they called him Charles Foster Kane. But Hearst knew it was Hearst, right? And so he wouldn't advertise. And he threatened other magazines and newspapers to try and get them to. He offered to buy the only print of the film and to burn it. He offered almost $1 million, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. They knew that this movie had significance and it was important to society. It was directed by an upstart director at the time. And Orson Welles, he was famous for radio. He had a radio show. He had done The War of the Worlds, where they did a live broadcast of War of the Worlds, the H.G. Wells story, but they did it dramatically, and people actually thought that the Martians had invaded the U.S. And they did it so effectively with sound effects and everything. People were actually jumping out of their windows, right? It was kind of a scandal at the time, but it was also established him in the public consciousness. Nobody didn't know who Orson Welles was at this point. He got his deal with RKO Films. They basically gave him a green light to do anything he wanted to. Kind of went to his head. He took extra time to edit. It took longer to get the film out than it should have. He fought with some critics. He, kind of on the side mentioned, it's William Randolph Hearst. We all know that. So he kind of did himself in a way and kind of nixed the capability of this film with breaking even early on. But ultimately, it's considered, AFI still has it as the #1 film of all time. So, and the techniques that he used, we still use. So look at it from that standpoint, if nothing else. Now, 1934 film, It Happened One Night. Clark Gable took off his shirt to reveal he did not have an undershirt on. This was the end of undershirt sales in America. Believe it or not, all men wore undershirts up until this point. When he didn't have one on underneath, all guys went, well, if it's good enough for Clark Gable, it's good enough for me. I'm not buying any more undershirts. Now, okay, undershirt sales plummeted. This is the power of movies, guys. This is how much movies influenced our public psyche. Now, in 1938, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that major film studios represented a monopoly. Remember oligopoly from last time? And a major antitrust suit was initiated. 2 years later, the studios agreed to stop buying theaters because here's the deal. The theaters, the studios owned the backlots. They made the movies. They released the movies. They owned the theaters. And then they were doing this block booking thing where they forced the theaters to take all the crappy movies just so they could get the first run movies that everybody wanted to see. So block booking was kind of the beginning of the end for the studios. But it also broke the stranglehold that studios had on everybody, including, I said everybody was under contract. The crews were under contract to a studio. You couldn't work at another studio. If you wanted to work on a movie, you worked at RKO, or you worked at MGM, or you worked at Paramount. You couldn't work for anybody else. And the stars were under contract too. You could not act in a movie produced by another studio. It was like tightly held by these moguls, the studio moguls of the day. So, 4 years later, the major studios still held control over the motion picture industry. They pretended to release control because of, selling off some of their theaters. Now the theaters are independent. They don't have to take our movies. Of course they did. You want the major, you have to take all the little B and C movies in a block. Otherwise, you don't get the blockbusters. You don't get the movies that everybody wants to see. So they started another antitrust suit. The government went after them again for violating the first antitrust suit that was decided against the theaters. So ultimately, all theaters had to sell, or all studios had to sell their theaters. Up until then, all the theaters were owned by the production companies. Now, another problem resulted. Without the previous level of control and the profit guarantees, banks stopped investing in movies because the studios could pretty much guarantee a return on investment because they own the theaters. They know that the movie's going to at least break even, or, they don't make the movie. All the investors are making money without the guarantee of showing in a X number of theaters. Suddenly, investors are squeamish. They're not ready to take that risk. So, the studios finally decided to leave the production of films and much of the financial risk to independent producers, outside producers. This is the beginning of the independent film era, okay, where studios finally gave up some of their control. This was in the 30s and into the 40s. Now, the antitrust action ushered in the beginning of an era which production companies were created for a particular film and then disbanded right afterwards. We still have that model to this day. The movies that you guys are going to be working on, you're going to be working for an LLC, a company that's only there for the sake of producing that movie. And then after that movie, all the expenses are paid, that LLC goes away. Now, stars and directors are no longer under long-term contracts. Actors and crew members are hired specifically for films. Still the model we have to this day. Now, although the studio system was efficient at turning out films, most people agree that our present system encourages a level of competition essential to maintaining Hollywood's leadership in filmmaking and high production standards. Now, today, the major studios usually make fewer than 20 films a year, and the rest are made by independents. A lot of times, the studios go together to make the big movies, so they're not each individually taking a huge risk financially. Otherwise, one film could sink a studio. One big flop could sink a studio. And it's happened in the past. So by going together, by banding together, and that's why there's so many credits at the beginning of a movie with all of the logos from all the different studios, because they are sharing the expense of producing the movie. That way they can also share the revenues. Now, the biggest impact in the history of movies after the stock market crash of 1929 was the advent of television. Right after World War II ended, televisions became ubiquitous. Everyone had one in their home, and people stayed home. They didn't go to the theaters to watch movies. And movie sales plummeted from 1955 to 1970. Boom, it tanked. Before that, everybody went to the movies at least once a week. Everybody. And after that, what's the need? It's more comfortable sitting in my living room and watch a movie. So, TV was now the major source of creative outlet as well. Movies are being made for television at this point. Many film studios put short-sighted clauses into actors' contracts forbidding them to appear on television. They said, you go to television, you're done here. We're never going to have you work. You'll never work in this town again. You've heard that one, right? Now, however, the studios realized that instead of being the enemy, television could actually be their saving grace. It could be what keeps them afloat. So, once they realized this, studios abandoned the expensive star system. They started investing in lesser-known actors who had already established themselves on television sometimes. And they limited their promotional budgets. And they went for a smaller target audience, a niche audience on a lot of films, resulting in some of the best films that we've ever seen. They started making films aimed at educated and affluent viewers. Before that, it was the general public, right? Especially people under 30 who became their largest audience, accounting for 70%, 75% of ticket sales in those days. People under 30, they're the ones who want to get out of the house. Mom and Dad, I'm going to go see a movie. They want to get out of the house. They want to go see a movie. Then that became their key demographic. So they cater to the key demographic with exploitation films. These new audiences, although smaller, demanded more in the way of meaningful content and sophisticated production techniques. They want a better movie for their money. So simplistic, low-budget, formulaic plots, commonly known for in Hollywood's golden era, were not as popular with younger, more sophisticated audiences. They wanted something cutting edge. They wanted something poignant. Sidney Poitier was a very popular actor of the day, and this film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, was one of those cutting-edge films. With the arrival of television, Hollywood found a new, seemingly insatiable market for the old movies. The movies that have been sitting on the shelf all of the years since they had their first release now have a second life on television with the new generation. So during the early days of television, they dug out old black and white films and sold them to television. When color TV arrived, the studios went into the vaults again and dug out the color films that had been sitting there for a while. So television is keeping the studios afloat all of this time. Now, in the 1950s, while the studios are again facing a financial crisis, they fought hard to retain their audiences with a lot of techniques. Remember, in the 30s, they did, what was it, double features, bingo games, all that stuff. In the 50s, they resort to other things, like 3D movies. Remember the red and the blue glasses? You've seen them in the pictures, right? 3D movies. They were pretty lame at the time, I got to tell you. But they went to wider and wider and wider screens. They went to, the stereo, the cinematoscope, but they even did one called Cinerama. Cinerama is actually 3 cameras mounted side by side, shooting sections of a landscape and then projected with 3 projectors side by side. So there's some epic films from that day that were shot in Cinerama, and you can see it. You can see the fact that there's actually a little seam in 2 different places in the screen, but super wide. You would sit in a Cinerama theater and it would wrap around you. It was a curved screen. It was amazing to sit in. I saw a few films in Cinerama theaters before they all went away. Stereophonic sound, stereo. Up until then, everything's a monaural track, single track. Then there's stereo, and suddenly you're feeling like there's something. You hear something over here, and you realize it's coming out of a different speaker. It makes the experience more realistic. Didn't have that at home. You only had that in the theaters. You had to go to the theater to experience these things. And of course, they went to their old standby: violent and risque subject matter. People want risque, people want violence. And that's what movies are trying to give you, is what you want. So on the average, only 1 in every 6 films is profitable. Now, such a successful film takes in as much more than the production costs and is very profitable. So people are willing to roll those dice. If they got expendable capital, if they got money to burn, people will invest in movies, even though they realize that the odds are 90% against their, 85% against their breaking even, okay? But they will take that risk. Now, the average cost of producing a film today is well over $40 million. We call a $10 million movie a low-budget movie. We call a $1 to $3 million movie a no-budget movie. That's $1 to $3 million. Now, today, Hollywood films don't usually make a profit until they resort to other profit sources. Theatrical isn't going to make them break even for the most part. This is theatrical, this little blue triangle. Home video is at least 50% of the profits. Then you've got foreign. Then you've got free TV. Then you've got pay TV. Then you've got licensing. You've got all of the other resources that you can capitalize on to make a profit back on your movie. Ancillary profits, they call that. And foreign has gotten bigger and bigger, I've got to tell you. Now, over the past decade, income from all genres has flipped from domestic to primarily foreign. If you can see, these are charts over the last 10 years, and the profits have gone from, this is international is the orange, and blue is domestic. So we are making a lot more money on foreign release than we ever do these days on domestic release. Why is that important? That tells us that Well, for one thing, we have to cater to a different audience, right? We have to make films that are easier to translate to foreign release. Talkie movies don't translate well to foreign release. Action movies, comedies, things like that always have released well in foreign countries. So here's action, here's comedy, here's drama, here's horror. Surprisingly, horror does well in the U.S. as well as it does in foreign markets. But almost in every case, foreign has surpassed domestic box office in return on investment. So, it took broadcast television years to adopt the HD standard. And it's already antiquated. I mean, within the last 10 years, broadcast television has finally said, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to bite the bullet. We're going to invest in HD. HD, guys, is over. It's 4K now, right? And who knows what comes after 4K? So, what a term that you probably haven't heard, OTT, is called over the top. It's streaming platforms. OTT are the streaming platforms. Things like Roku and Fire and Apple TV and Xbox and Chromecast and PlayStation, and all of those have 4K and capable of higher streaming capability. Broadcast doesn't. Broadcast is on its way out. Okay? So, this is where the future of movies lies. You can see a very high resolution movie in the theater, but you can also see it now in your home through streaming. So, along with that is a whole new revenue model. That means there are new people investing in feature films that were there 5 to 10 years ago. People like Netflix and Amazon and Hulu are investing huge sums of money to create product that they can show on their streaming platforms because they're making big bucks on their streaming platforms. So broadcast is on its way out, streaming is on its way in. Now, the big six studios are producing less content and are producing for streaming providers. So, students here participated in the rollout of one of the new streaming services, Disney Plus, by making Lady and the Tramp. And I probably had 12 students working on Lady and the Tramp. It was Disney Plus's first big offering that could only be watched on Disney Plus through streaming. And it's paying off. Content is improving, similar to the way it did during the independent movie boom of the 1970s. So, times are changing, platforms are changing. So, even though films have had a sordid history, even though films have had high times and low times, films are always going to be here. Media will always be here. We will always want to be entertained. But with changing times come changing platforms and changing attitudes and changing desires of what you want to watch on television, right? So, thought-provoking films and films where the hero takes a stand against corruption inspire us to take stands in our own lives. Films have always inspired us. It doesn't matter if it's captured on celluloid or a collection of zeros and ones. Motion pictures have had a more profound effect on the collective consciousness of society than any other art form. They can make us laugh, bring us to tears, and teach us important lessons. And as a filmmaker, the work you create will live on beyond your years. Make some great movies.